Here we go, part two. I was afraid that they'd cut me off at the 10-minute mark, so I stopped it there. So he sees a consistency here in 1 Chronicles 10 with earlier Samuel material, similar to the consistency he saw in verse 6. Um, this is better than, he suggests, than the inconsistency found in Samuel itself. So in Samuel's version, we have the head being cut off, but then no mention of the head. Then the body's being taken, and um, and then no mention of the head again. So there's an inconsistency there that he suggests um, is made better with the chronicler version. Some suggest that the chronicler is smoothing over the edges or the rough surfaces. Um, However, Ho doesn't disagrees and suggests that this is a better representation of the original. Finally, in verse 12, he says there's different treatments of the bodies, right? So in verse 12, um, in 1 Samuel 31, comes an unusual um, instance where the bodies are burned. And he suggests that this is very rare and sacrilegious and befitting of not befitting of the treatment of a former king. But in the chronicler version, we find that they're buried, that there is a fast proclaimed, and the I know it doesn't say this in our Endress book, but in some translations, um, and maybe even in the Hebrew, there's a difference in the kind of tree. Not a tamarisk tree, but a oak tree, as mentioned in 1 Chronicles 10. And Ho suggests that this is also connected to earlier Samuel material, in that it's connected and more consistent with 1 Samuel 11. And here is the narrative of the relationship that Saul had with the people of Jabesh Gilead, which would suggest a favorable treatment of the body rather than the burning that you find in 1 Samuel 31. So, in summary, uh, because of the strength of the consistency of First Chronicles with the variants and the Saul materials are early, he suggests that First Chronicles 10 is a better reading of the original material. Ho also notes that the chronicler version is 13% less. There's fewer words, and there are fewer pluses, so fewer additions, which also would favor the First Chronicle version. Um, and Not all of these would be for the chronicler's own theological purposes, because the first chronicler stays truer to the material found in the Deuteronomic history than its own theological base. So, Ho says, if Chronicles did not change material because the inconsistency points to it, then First Samuel changed the original, and First Chronicles is closer to the original. So I tried to find some information about Craig Ho. He is a scholar, a professor at Hong Kong Baptist University. He studied in Europe at the University of Edinburgh. He's a conservative, evangelical. He is typically what you might call a form critic. So he's looking for source material. rather than a redaction critic who is looking for the theological purposes of the author. And so this may point to some of the bias that he might have. Because he's a form critic, he may be more concerned with the history than the theology of the author. Um, and another possible bias is that the only person that he references as being a contemporary common source person just so happens to be his advisor at University of Edinburgh, Old. Um, so it's more likely for him to favor this position. Um, what are some impacts or implications if we accept his position? Well, we may not see the Chronicler as an independent book. What do I mean by this? I mean, if the chronicler is relying so heavily to a common source, then the independence of the chronicler is diminished, and therefore uh, the chronicler's theology is also minimized. So we could see Chronicles as merely just a historical document rather than a theological, having theological significance. Um, this possibly could also deny the post-exilic context. If it's as he says that it's truer to an original source, then this source most likely is going to be pre-exilic. Um, uh, I don't know, maybe a final observation is that a possible bias that Ho might have is that he cannot um, rationalize or come up with a result that there are two competing histories, two histories that are very similar but do have some differences, and maybe he can't accept that there are these differences. Um, but I would suggest that while this is very persuasive for this chapter, it does not, however, it does not suggest that the rest of the text, the rest of Chronicle material, follows such a pattern. And he hasn't given any evidence to suggest so. So that's why I suggested that the answer to his question in his title is maybe, because one chapter does not make a persuasive enough argument to suggest that the whole text is now derived from a common source. I hope this has been fruitful, and I'm sure we'll chat more about it. Thanks. Good night, or good morning.